Good morning. Can you hear me? Give me a second as I get over the horror of hearing my own voice over a speaker system. It's not something I hear all day, so thank you so much for joining me today. So I'm going to get personal right off the bat. Here I am in my class photo in grade 4. I'll give you a few minutes to see if you can find me. It's tough, I know. If you can't, there I am. That's me rocking the old man look with a clip-on tie and a wool vest. When I was 8, I was a finalist in a speech contest, which is crazy, against this girl, Anne. She was tiny, but man, she was a force. She was the cutest, smartest, most outgoing kid in the class. And I, on the other hand, I was more reserved, I was quiet, I was kind of average when it came to grades. But I was really proud of the speech that I was going to give. My speech was on Halley's Comet. And if you're not familiar with Halley's Comet, it was a comet that was discovered by this astronomer named Edmund Halley, and he discovered that this comet sort of looped around the universe and became visible in our atmosphere every 76 years. And at the time, it was going to be coming by soon to be seen. It's pretty cool, right? So Anne's speech was on how much she loved rabbits. Yeah, seriously. I actually thought I would win on topic alone. But you know what? She kicked my ass. She spoke flawlessly, with confidence and conviction. Me, I was the opposite of all of those things. I tripped up on a couple of lines. My legs were shaking, kind of like they are now. And to be honest, I couldn't care less about space. When it came down to it, there's only one reason why she won. She spoke with intention. She was intent on convincing people that rabbits are awesome. I was intent on just getting through the speech without fainting. So I guess you could say we both achieved what we intended to do, but she just happened to take home a giant trophy for doing so. So I didn't learn anything from that experience. I mean, I was 8 years old, so it's not like I realized, I need to apply the power of intention to everything in my life after that. Looking back, however, I can see another reason why she won. She brought herself into the speech. My speech lacked personality. It lacked my personality. So what's interesting is that back then I was sort of known as the artist of the class. And, the thing is, I was good at drawing, but, I was only good at drawing what I could see. I'd copy superheroes and hockey players. I'm Canadian after all. And I measured my ability on how close to the real thing that it was. So I never added anything to them to make them more unique or imaginative. I just measured my work on how accurate it was to the actual real thing. And I didn't want to add anything. So the thing is, I didn't bring myself to my art either. I didn't do that until I grew up and discovered design. I was drawn to creativity that had reason. It wasn't until many years later when I would bring all of myself to a project that I was genuinely passionate about. And that was when I took the opportunity to head up the creative direction for California Sunday and Pop-Up magazine. Now, don't get me wrong, I've brought myself and my work to many things over the years, but up until then, I had helped realize the visions of other people, my bosses, my creative mentors. This would be the first time I would define and lead the vision for an organization myself. And I'd start it from scratch. And that was a tall order. Now, gaining the confidence and experience, much like Anne was just sort of innate with this ability, I had to prepare myself for it. And it took some time. It took a long time. So, my first job as a junior designer in Toronto, I was really excited. I was joining a company in Toronto called Concrete, and I was a junior designer there. I was so excited. I loved their work. I loved the people there, and I was really excited. But that first week was so traumatic because I just kind of really embarrassed myself. The there was this one situation where we were going over some design sketches with another senior designer. It wasn't my work, it was someone else's. And they asked me just a very simple question. What do you think, Leo? And I just froze. I was completely speechless. I actually had nothing to say. And it wasn't because I was shy. It was because I just lacked experience when it came to being asked for feedback. I was so embarrassed by that. And there's nothing more fragile, I swear, than the confidence of a very young designer right out of art school. I could see my confidence just crumbling before my very eyes. But I was determined to learn how to gain an opinion. So I started to actively listen to others' opinions about my work and how they responded to other people's work. I'd noticed recurring feedback, so I'd apply those critiques to my own work preemptively, so as a way of self-art directing myself. And my work slowly got better because of it. Over time, I began to learn to critique myself and ask myself the same questions until it became second nature to me. And through that, I developed my own opinions about things, and I could sort of offer opinions to my own work, but also give constructive feedback to others as well. It occurred to me that learning to see critically the way my colleagues did was teaching me the value of perspective. Everyone had something different to offer. I realized that the way I see things today is not solely my own. It's the culmination of everyone I've shown my work to for criticism. And I know it's not easy being vulnerable and opening yourself up to people, but I grew whenever I did. So even though I'm the boss now, I still ask for the opinion of others because it's the only way my perspective can continue to grow and evolve. So that's how I learned my opinion and how I gained some confidence and perspective on things. And that's how it prepared me for the opportunities ahead of me. So as a company, an organization as Pop-Up Magazine Productions, as a company, I have to admit, we never said to ourselves, we need to set an intention for the company. You'd think we were setting up a yoga practice or something. I don't want to poo-poo any of the yogis in the room. They're definitely onto something. And when they talk about setting an intention, they're actually bringing mindfulness to a quality or a virtue. And when it's framed that way, I guess you could say we do have intentions. So there's a few things that we're always mindful of. And that first thing is serve the story. The story is the root, the foundation of everything that we do. Everything stems from that. And we always look for stories that are memorable and surprising and something that you've never heard before. Usually they're character driven, there's a lot of scenes, and there's a lot of layers. There's something beyond what is interesting from the very beginning. And with that, we try to make it beautiful. You know, we work with photographers and illustrators, and we try to envision what that story can be in a visual way. You know, there's this really great quote by Buckminster Fuller, this famous architect back in the day. And I'm not much of a quote guy, but there was one quote that has always resonated with me as a designer. And he said that when I'm working on a problem, I never think about the beauty. I only think about how to solve the problem. And when I've finished, if the solution is not beautiful, then I know it's wrong. And so the order of this, the order of serving the story, that's the main function. And then making it beautiful is sort of a secondary thing. So that's sort of a priority of ours. And the final thing is to surprise the reader or the audience. Nowadays, you can look up so many things on the internet. You can find out how good a restaurant is, how good a movie is. There's just no surprise anymore. And in a way, it's kind of rare. And so we take all of these things together, and when we keep these in mind as we're doing our work, it sort of feeds into the visual spirit of what we do. So with Pop-Up Magazine, we take the magazine off the page and onto the stage. It's a highly produced show that tours nationwide, and it's made up of short stories, long stories, stories that make you laugh, stories that make you think, and stories that even might make you cry. Our house band, Magic Magic Orchestra, composes music specifically for each story. And that way it sort of acts as almost like a live soundtrack. And on screen, we'll have beautiful photography and animation, which adds to the sort of immersive quality of the storytelling experience. And you never know, sometimes we'll even surprise you with performance artists, if it's appropriate, whether it's like dance or shadow puppets or opera singers. And when it's over, it's gone. We don't record the show, and you can't view it anywhere online. It's a completely ephemeral experience that lives on only in your memory. So with California Sunday, we're a general interest magazine. We tell deeply reported stories of national interest, and it's a magazine about people, and they're based in California, the West, Latin America, and Asia. So before I started designing, our founder, Doug McGray, had one word to describe what he wanted California Sunday to be, and that word was cinematic. That alone was the inspiration for the biggest design decisions in the magazine. And that sparked something in me. It started me thinking about the idea of what visual storytelling can be. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Paul Kirchner. He was a comic strip artist in the 70s and 80s. And for 6 years, he drew this monthly comic called The Bus. And it was a really mundane scenario about a man waiting for a bus, but everything he experienced while waiting was anything but typical. And so what was really great about this series is that it was very simple, that there was no words involved. It was primarily a narrative sequence based on visuals. And there was something interesting about that, and how fresh he sort of treated that every single time. And sometimes it would get surreal, and sometimes it would get really fun and charming. Just really, really great work. This is back in the 70s and 80s. The other artist that I wanted to share with you today, I don't know if you can see that, this is the work of a British photographer named Paul Graham. My photo director, Jackie Bates, introduced his work to me, and she said that there was a couple of years ago, there was an exhibition at Pier 24 by the Bay Bridge, and she said, you just got to check this out. And I was blown away. And you know, the photographs are beautiful, but what's really interesting is how he installs it in the space. And the mixture of the different sizes, the fluidity, and the organicness of the way he installs it, it gives a sense of a cinematic feel. And that's what I was really drawn to. He would also sometimes just sort of juxtapose different images to give a different sort of sensibility. So what I loved about that is that those two artists, and many other artists as well for that matter, they use sort of traditional mediums, and like in that case comics and photography, and but the way that they presented their work was rather unconventional. There was something just sort of very different and memorable and gratifying about the way they did that. And so how do I do that for a magazine? You know, for any magazine, the biggest visual moments are the cover and the opening spreads that introduce the stories. So I wanted to try to approach those things a little bit differently. I wanted to lean into the page-turning experience. Now I know that seems like an odd thing to say, to call it a page-turning experience. It seems like you're adding a fancy phrase to something that's very monotonous. But the truth is, the act of turning the page is revealing something unknown. And if you can play with the reader's anticipation and feed into it, then you're making it an interactive experience that's also memorable. So there are two beats to our covers. The first beat is to be impactful and intriguing, just enough to make you wonder, what's that about? And you'll notice that our covers very rarely have cover lines. And that was sort of a conscious decision. It was a grand decision by our founder, Doug McGray, where he said, like, what do you think of covers that don't have cover lines? And so the artful side of me was very excited. But the designer in me, the one that sort of solves problems and communicates things, was kind of horrified because, in a way, text really helps. It helps to clarify things. And when you don't have text, it's sometimes ambiguous. So that balance of being intriguing is something that's kind of tough to do. And so the other reason why we wanted to sort of go without cover lines is to stand out. We're included in the couple of the national or statewide newspapers here, the LA Times and the SF Chronicle, and we wanted to stand out from the walls of text of the newspaper. So the second beat is the spread that follows. And usually that's sort of dedicated to big ad space. So it was a tough sell to really just sort of tell our team to be like, what if we sort of included editorial instead? But we see it as a 2-beat cover, so it's not just sort of the first pages of the magazine, it's part of the cover. And what this does is it continues the visual narrative of what you establish on the cover. And so after that intrigue, which is the cover, we provide clarity to the reader of what that story is about. So at first when you enter it, you're like, who is this person? And then when you turn the page, you find out who that person is. And that, in this case, is Rene Redzepi, sort of the acclaimed chef that, in this case, closed Noma down in Copenhagen and opened up a pop-up restaurant in Australia. And so what this does is it establishes the cinematic look right away and sets the pace for the rest of the magazine. And it's a challenge to think of different ways to make this experience surprising each time. Because as soon as you start doing the same thing over and over, it starts, you start to lose that surprising quality that we often want to do. This was another one. It might be clear what he's about to do. Sometimes we don't have access to our characters in our story. This is about a man who was a very sort of well-liked and polite man and very successful and very kind to everyone around him. But he was in jail because he was suffering from this debilitating brain disease, and it affected his sort of motor skills and his behavioral skills, and he ended up being a drug dealer because of this condition. And so we didn't have access to him because he was in prison, but we had access to some archival photos of his, some personal photos. And so what we did here was we hired a collage artist to work with that and be able to sort of give this visual narrative of what's happened to him and support it with a quote from the story. This was a piece on how Silicon Valley was entering politics. A very subtle thing with the addition of the American flag on the lapel. So by itself, it also has to be very impactful. We can't just rely on just the continuation of that narrative every single time to draw the reader in. By itself, the cover needs to be good. This was an interesting one because it's a challenge as a designer. As I was saying before, when you don't have text on a cover, it's a little ambiguous, And if you can imagine, I know that you probably can't read that text, which is probably good for now. The reason why I say that is because when you don't have text, you kind of just don't know, you don't have a reason to pick up a magazine. So if I gave this to you and you weren't able to read that text, you have no sense of like, oh, is there a reason why I should read this magazine and grab it? I don't know who this person is and why I should care. But the simple addition of text just changes everything. And I'll give you, this is a prime example. And what that text says is, why my son? And so all of a sudden, there's context to what you're looking at. And it's interesting because it's a real sign of the times when that's all you need to say to realize and know that her son has been killed by the SFPD. So again, the turn page just to get a sense of this is her home and what it's like. You get a very intimate look at this person. So this sort of strategy of being able to create a narrative with visuals is something that we also try to use for the storytelling aspect of our opening spreads of our stories. So this story was about Forrest Fenn. And what he did was he buried a number of antique, very valuable antiques in a chest and buried it somewhere in the Rocky Mountains and basically made it sort of a riddle or an adventure for people to find. And in terms of storytelling, to be able to sort of show the expansiveness of that land over a couple of spreads just gave the reader a sense of how difficult it would be to find it. This was a profile on Roy Choi, the chef in LA. Again, trying to be impactful, taking advantage of that page-turning experience. Nowadays, the immigration is a big thing right now, and the separation of families, and we often do a lot of stories on them. This was a story about how a mother was deported to Mexico and was separated from her children who were based in the U.S., and the difficulty of the choice that the kids have to make as to whether or not they should leave the country to join her in Mexico. And so here, the layout is trying to sort of build a physical distance between them. Again, typography can be very expressive, but also it should work with the photography and not work and compete against it. This is one where I wanted you to feel like you were there, you were in the crowd as this man was announcing who's looking for a fight. So sometimes the typography is also expressive, but very straight here. This was a story about a small town in Gillette, Wyoming. They rely on industry like the coal industry, and they're very huge gun advocates, and they love their country. And so this is an interesting profile on them, and I wanted to sort of play up that sort of pride in their town. Again, sort of the sequence of images of starting from the surface level of a glacier and dropping in on the next spread. Sometimes commissioning illustration is something that's really fun and interesting, but the idea of using many artists to collaborate on one particular illustration is something that was surprising to me and something that I don't see often in other magazines. Again, those are things that I want to try to do. This is a story about Daniel Close, who's a graphic novel artist based in Berkeley. And sometimes, just a single spread is all you need to be impactful. It's not like we set out to always do multiple spreads to introduce a story. It's rather indulgent at times, so if you can be as impactful in a minimal space, all the better. And so, after all that talk about myself, you have to know that I can't do all of this work on my own. There's a lot of editors and researchers and photographers and illustrators we work with. There's a lot of people involved in making the work that we do. This is my small but fearless art team. They work with intention and purpose every single day. And this is us just a few months ago accepting the award for Magazine of the Year, the top prize given at an awards gala that celebrates the best in design and photography in magazines. It was a really proud moment. And holding that trophy 35 years later, I have to admit, rabbits are really awesome. Thank you.